The single boundary that transforms an avoidance indifference into genuine attachment, their emotional distance into desperate pursuit, and their comfortable detachment into uncomfortable obsession isn't what most people expect. It is not patience, understanding, or unconditional love that captures their heart permanently, but rather the firm establishment of complete emotional independence that eliminates their power to affect your emotional state, your life satisfaction, or your sense of worth through their typical tactics of withdrawal, withholding, and strategic unavailability. This boundary operates as a psychological reversal that disrupts every pattern the avoidant has perfected throughout their relationship history, eliminating their comfortable position as the pursued party while forcing them into unfamiliar territory where they must work for attention they previously took for granted, pursue connection they previously avoided, and invest emotional energy in someone whose well-being operates independently of their choices and behavior. Understanding this boundary becomes essential because it represents the only condition under which avoidance develops genuine rather than strategic attachment. The sole circumstance where their defensive programming relaxes enough to allow authentic emotional investment, and the unique situation where their attachment system finally engages because it recognizes that its usual protective strategies have become irrelevant when directed at someone who doesn't need what the avoidant has been strategically withholding. Most people approach avoidance with increasing emotional investment, patient understanding, and sustained pursuit that inadvertently reinforces the very patterns they hope to overcome. The more you chase, the more they retreat. The more you invest, the less they reciprocate. The more you demonstrate your attachment, the more comfortable they become with their emotional distance, because your behavior confirms they hold power over your emotional state. The boundary that changes everything operates through complete reversal of this dynamic. When you establish genuine emotional independence that makes their presence optional rather than essential, their attention welcome but not necessary, and their love desirable but not required for your psychological stability and life satisfaction, you eliminate the very foundation upon which their defensive strategies depend for effectiveness and psychological comfort. This single boundary proves more powerful than any amount of patience because it forces the avoidant to confront that their usual relationship dynamics don't work with you, that their emotional distance creates no effect on someone whose happiness operates independently, and that their withholding strategies lose all power when directed at someone who has nothing they desperately need and everything they've learned to take for granted in partners who organize their emotional lives around securing the avoidant's attention. Understanding why this boundary works requires recognizing that avoidants are attracted to what they cannot easily control, obsessed with what they cannot easily obtain, and compelled to pursue what might disappear if they don't invest effort. Your emotional independence transforms you from someone seeking their validation into someone whose approval they must earn, whose attention they must work for, and whose continued presence requires their genuine investment rather than minimal effort. The boundary represents psychological checkmate against their defensive programming because it eliminates every tool in their manipulation arsenal. They cannot punish you with withdrawal when you don't need their presence, cannot control you through withholding when you don't require what they're withholding, and cannot maintain comfortable distance when such distance costs them access to someone whose value they finally recognize through the risk of permanent loss. Most significantly, this boundary only works when it's authentic rather than strategic, when your emotional independence stems from genuine self-sufficiency rather than performed indifference designed to manipulate their behavior, and when your life satisfaction operates truly independently rather than secretly depending on their eventual pursuit, validating your worth and confirming their attachment despite their defensive patterns. The avoidant attachment develops under this boundary because it represents the only condition where loving you feels safe rather than suffocating, where emotional investment enhances rather than threatens their autonomy, and where their defensive strategies become unnecessary because you're not demanding the vulnerability they cannot provide or creating the pressure their attachment wounds interpret as psychological danger, requiring immediate protective withdrawal and emotional distance. Understanding this boundary doesn't guarantee the avoidant transformation or justify investment in someone whose attachment depends on your emotional unavailability rather than emerging naturally through healthy relationship development. It simply reveals the psychological conditions under which their defensive system relaxes enough to allow genuine rather than strategic connection, authentic rather than manipulated attachment, and real rather than performed emotional investment in partnership. The boundary that changes everything. The boundary that transforms avoidant indifference into genuine attachment is deceptively simple yet profoundly challenging to maintain complete emotional independence, where your happiness, sense of worth, and life satisfaction operate entirely separately from their behavior, attention, or presence in your life. This boundary eliminates their power to affect your emotional state through their typical arsenal of withdrawal, emotional withholding, and strategic unavailability that characterizes their defensive relationship patterns and systematic destruction of authentic, intimate connections. This boundary manifests through genuine rather than performed indifference to their emotional availability, authentic rather than strategic contentment with or without their presence, and real rather than manufactured satisfaction through sources that don't include them or depend on their validation for your sense of worth and psychological well-being. The avoidant must witness your consistent emotional stability regardless of their behavior, your continued life satisfaction whether they're present or absent, and your maintained sense of worth independent of their attention or approval. Understanding this boundary means recognizing that it's not about playing games, performing disinterest, or strategically withdrawing to manipulate their pursuit. Such tactics fail because avoidants detect inauthenticity through their sophisticated psychological radar and dismiss strategic behavior as manipulation rather than recognizing it as genuine emotional independence that makes you fundamentally different from partners they've previously encountered and easily controlled. The boundary requires actually building a life so fulfilling, engaging, and satisfying that the avoidant's presence enhances rather than completes your experience, where their attention provides enjoyment rather than validation, and where their love offers addition rather than serving as foundation for your psychological stability and emotional well-being. This authentic independence cannot be faked or performed because avoidants recognize the difference between genuine self-sufficiency and strategic distance designed to trigger their pursuit. This boundary changes everything because it eliminates the avoidant's primary source of relationship power, their ability to regulate your emotional state through their availability or distance, to control relationship dynamics through strategic withholding, and to maintain comfortable superiority through your demonstrated need for what they refuse to consistently provide. When you genuinely don't need their emotional availability for your well-being, their usual manipulation tactics become powerless and irrelevant. The avoidant experiences this boundary as psychological disorientation that disrupts every pattern they've perfected throughout their relationship history. Suddenly, their withdrawal generates no pursuit, their emotional distance creates no anxiety, and their unavailability produces no desperate attempts to restore connection from someone whose life continues satisfyingly, whether they're emotionally present or defensively absent. Most significantly, this boundary forces the avoidant to confront that they're not the prize in the relationship, but rather one of many valuable aspects of your fulfilling life, that they're not irreplaceable, but rather fortunate to have access to someone whose emotional capacity and life satisfaction don't depend on their limited ability to provide consistent care and sustained emotional presence within intimate partnership. The boundary becomes transformative when the avoidant recognizes that losing you would mean losing access to someone exceptional rather than losing someone desperate for their attention, that your continued presence in their life is a choice rather than a need, and that maintaining your interest requires their genuine effort rather than minimal investment that previously sufficed with partners who organize their emotional worlds around securing the avoidant's approval. Understanding why this boundary works means acknowledging that avoidants are compelled to pursue what they might lose, obsessed with what they cannot control, and attracted to what represents genuine value rather than desperate availability. Your emotional independence transforms their perception of you from someone seeking their validation into someone whose approval they must earn through sustained emotional investment and authentic reciprocal care. The boundary also eliminates the very pressure that triggers their defensive withdrawal when you're not demanding their emotional availability, not creating intimacy pressure, and not requiring their sustained presence for your psychological stability. Their nervous system relaxes around the fear of being consumed or controlled through someone else's emotional dependency on their attention and care. Most importantly, this boundary reveals whether the avoidant possesses capacity for genuine attachment or only strategic connection. If your emotional independence triggers their pursuit and sustained investment, they may possess potential for healthy relationship development. If your independence simply makes them comfortable with minimal effort, they lack capacity for authentic partnership, regardless of relationship circumstances or partner qualities. Why? Complete emotional independence triggers their attachment. The avoidance attachment system activates most powerfully when confronted with complete emotional independence, because such independence eliminates every psychological trigger that normally activates their defensive programming, while simultaneously creating the scarcity, uncertainty, and potential loss that their nervous system interprets as requiring immediate attention and genuine emotional investment. Your independence transforms their comfortable relationship dynamic, where they hold power through withholding into unfamiliar territory, where they must compete for access to someone whose value they finally recognize, through the genuine possibility of permanent loss. This attachment triggering operates through psychological reversal of their typical relationship patterns. Instead of you pursuing them while they retreat, they find themselves pursuing you while you maintain your emotional center. Instead of you needing their validation while they withhold it, they discover themselves seeking your approval while you remain genuinely indifferent to their assessment. Instead of you organizing your life around their availability, they recognize they must accommodate your schedule and priorities to maintain access to your time and attention. Understanding why independence triggers attachment means recognizing that avoidants are fundamentally attracted to what they cannot easily control or predict, what requires effort to obtain or maintain, and what might disappear if they don't invest genuine energy rather than minimal effort that previously sufficed with partners who demonstrated their desperate need for the avoidant's attention through consistent pursuit despite receiving emotional scraps and strategic unavailability. Your complete independence eliminates the suffocation they associate with emotional connection, because you're not depending on them for your happiness, not requiring their presence for your stability, and not creating the intimacy pressure that triggers their defensive withdrawal when partners make emotional demands that feel overwhelming to someone whose attachment wounds interpret normal relationship needs as psychological threats requiring immediate protective distance. The independence also triggers their competitive instincts and ego protection when they observe you thriving without them, receiving attention from others who recognize your worth, and demonstrating that you possess options beyond their limited emotional availability. Their nervous system activates pursued behaviors designed to secure valuable resources that might otherwise be claimed by competitors who can provide the reciprocal care they've been systematically withholding. Most significantly, your independence forces the avoidant to confront their own attachment to you precisely because You're not forcing such confrontation through demands, pressure, or emotional appeals that would trigger their defensive responses. When you're genuinely content with or without them, they must examine their own feelings rather than reacting to yours, must acknowledge their own needs rather than managing yours, and must confront their own attachment rather than defending against yours. The triggering effect operates through scarcity psychology, where your limited availability, genuine contentment, and authentic independence create perception that access to you represents valuable opportunity that requires effort to maintain rather than guaranteed resource they can take for granted, while providing minimal investment and reciprocal care within the relationship dynamic. Your independence also eliminates their ability to maintain comfortable narratives about relationships being suffocating or partners being needy. When confronted with someone whose emotional health and life satisfaction don't depend on their presence, they cannot rationalize their distance as reasonable response to excessive demands, because you're making no demands while simultaneously demonstrating that you deserve better treatment than their defensive patterns typically provide. Understanding this triggering reveals that avoidants need to feel they're choosing to pursue someone valuable rather than being pursued by someone desperate, that they're working to maintain something worth keeping rather than tolerating someone's attachment to them, and that they're investing in partnership that enhances their life rather than managing someone's emotional dependency that threatens their autonomy. The independence triggers their attachment because it represents the only condition where loving you feels like strength rather than weakness, where emotional investment feels like wise choice rather than dangerous vulnerability, and where commitment feels like securing something valuable rather than being trapped by someone else's needs that they cannot consistently meet without overwhelming their limited emotional capacity. Most importantly, your complete independence creates psychological safety for their attachment to develop, because it eliminates their deepest fears, that loving you will make them responsible for your happiness, that investing in you will eliminate their autonomy, and that committing to you will require sustained vulnerability that their attachment wounds make feel psychologically impossible to maintain without devastating consequences. The triggering effect also operates through their recognition that you represent rare find, someone with emotional depth who doesn't require their validation, someone with genuine caring capacity who doesn't depend on their reciprocation, and someone with authentic interest who won't sacrifice their own well-being to accommodate the avoidant's defensive limitations and systematic emotional unavailability. How your indifference becomes their obsession. The avoidant's obsession with your genuine indifference operates through psychological principles that make unavailable or unattainable objects more desirable than readily accessible ones, transforming your authentic emotional independence from neutral relationship factor into consuming preoccupation that dominates their thoughts and drives behaviors they've never demonstrated with partners who made their attachment obvious and their availability constant despite receiving minimal reciprocal investment. This obsession develops because your indifference represents the ultimate psychological puzzle for someone whose entire relationship history has involved partners desperately seeking their attention, patiently waiting for their emotional availability, and consistently pursuing connection despite their defensive withdrawal. Your genuine lack of need for their validation creates cognitive dissonance that their brain attempts to resolve through increased focus on understanding why you're different and what they must do to secure your continued interest. Understanding how indifference becomes obsession means recognizing that avoidants have learned to interpret pursuit as weakness and distance as strength, making your authentic indifference register as evidence of your superior emotional development, psychological health, and relationship sophistication that makes you more valuable than partners who demonstrated obvious need for their attention and validation. Your indifference triggers their obsession because it activates their ego protection mechanisms. They cannot tolerate being dismissed or undervalued by someone they initially assumed would pursue them like previous partners, forcing them to invest mental energy in analyzing why you're not responding to their usual patterns and what they must change to generate the interest and pursuit they've become accustomed to receiving without effort. The obsession intensifies when they realize their typical manipulation tactics produce no effect on your emotional state. Their withdrawal doesn't generate your pursuit. Their emotional unavailability doesn't create your anxiety. And their strategic distance doesn't trigger your desperate attempts to restore connection, forcing them to develop entirely new relationship approaches that require genuine effort rather than minimal investment that previously maintained their comfortable position of power. This obsessive focus operates through their need to solve the mystery of your indifference, to understand what makes you immune to their usual influence, and to discover what would be required to become important enough in your life to affect your emotional state and generate the kind of investment they've historically received from partners without providing reciprocal care or sustained emotional availability. Your indifference also becomes their obsession because it represents rejection they're not accustomed to experiencing. Throughout their relationship history, they've been the ones who maintain distance, control intimacy levels, and determine relationship progression, making your genuine disinterest in forcing their emotional availability feel like loss of power that triggers desperate attempts to restore their familiar position of being pursued rather than pursuing. Most significantly, your indifference forces them to confront their own feelings rather than reacting to yours, to examine their own attachment rather than managing yours, and to acknowledge their own needs rather than deflecting through focus on your supposedly excessive emotional requirements that they've used to justify their defensive patterns and systematic relationship sabotage. The obsession manifests through their increased attempts to contact you, their growing interest in your activities and social life, their heightened awareness of your interactions with others who might provide the reciprocal care they've been withholding, and their escalating investment in securing time and attention from someone whose schedule no longer revolves around their limited availability. Understanding this obsession reveals that avoidants become consumed by what they cannot control or predict, what requires effort they've never had to provide, and what threatens to disappear if they don't invest genuine energy rather than the minimal attention that previously maintained relationships with partners who demonstrated obvious attachment and consistent pursuit despite receiving emotional scraps. Your indifference triggers obsessive thoughts about what you're doing when you're not responding to their messages, who you're spending time with when you're unavailable for their last-minute plans, and whether you're developing connections with others who recognize your worth and provide the reciprocal care they've systematically withheld while taking your patience and understanding for granted. The obsession also operates through their ego protection. They cannot accept that someone they initially dismissed or undervalued might genuinely not need their attention, forcing them to invest increasing mental energy in proving to themselves that you still care, while simultaneously recognizing that such proof is absent because your indifference is authentic rather than strategic manipulation designed to trigger their pursuit. Most devastatingly for their comfortable defensive patterns, your indifference becomes their obsession because it represents the first time they've encountered someone whose emotional well-being genuinely doesn't depend on their behavior, whose life satisfaction truly operates independently of their presence, and whose sense of worth actually derives from sources other than their validation and attention. The psychology behind this paradox. The paradox that genuine emotional independence triggers avoidant attachment, while desperate pursuit repels them, operates through fundamental psychological principles about human desire, value perception, and the neurological wiring that makes scarcity more compelling than abundance, regardless of attachment style or defensive programming. This paradox reveals that avoidants, despite their sophisticated emotional defenses, remain subject to the same psychological laws governing desire and attachment that affect all humans. We want what we cannot easily have, value what requires effort to obtain, and become obsessed with what threatens to disappear before we've secured it. This psychological mechanism operates through the avoidance need to maintain their sense of superiority and control within relationships, making partners who demonstrate obvious need for their attention register as psychologically inferior and therefore less desirable than partners who demonstrate genuine independence and authentic self-sufficiency. Your emotional independence signals high value because it suggests you possess options, standards, and self-respect that prevent you from accepting the minimal investment that avoidants typically provide. Understanding this paradox means recognizing that avoidants interpret pursuit as evidence of desperation, patience as proof of limited options, and tolerance for their patterns as confirmation of low self-worth, making your indifference and independence register as signals of superior mate value that triggers their competitive instincts and desire to secure access to someone whose qualities suggest they're difficult to obtain and easy to lose, if not properly valued. The psychology includes their unconscious recognition that people who desperately need their attention lack the emotional resources and psychological strength they actually require in partners, while people who genuinely don't need their validation possess the very independence and self-sufficiency they claim to desire, but systematically push away through defensive patterns when such qualities are demonstrated through desperate pursuit rather than authentic indifference. Your independence triggers their attachment because it eliminates the pressure that activates their defensive programming. When you're not demanding their emotional availability, not creating intimacy obligations, and not making them responsible for your happiness, their nervous system can relax around the fear of being consumed or controlled, while simultaneously recognizing that maintaining access to you requires effort they've never had to provide with partners who remained available regardless of their treatment. The paradox operates through scarcity psychology, where limited availability creates perception of greater value than constant accessibility, making your genuine contentment with or without them more attractive than desperate need for their presence that characterized previous partners who organized their emotional lives around securing the avoidant's attention despite receiving minimal reciprocity and consistent emotional neglect. Most significantly, the psychology reveals that avoidants are attracted to strength rather than weakness, independence rather than dependency, and partners who choose them rather than need them, making your authentic emotional self-sufficiency more compelling than any amount of patient pursuit or demonstrated attachment that signals desperation rather than genuine appreciation for their specific qualities. The paradox also operates through their ego protection mechanisms. Being pursued by someone who needs them provides validation but triggers contempt because such need signals low value and poor judgment, while being ignored by someone who doesn't need them triggers both ego injury that demands repair and recognition that such a person represents higher value than partners whose obvious attachment made them easy to take for granted. Understanding this psychology means acknowledging that avoidants possess unconscious wisdom about relationship dynamics despite their conscious dysfunction. They recognize that healthy relationships require two complete individuals choosing each other rather than two incomplete people desperately clinging together, making your independence attractive precisely because it suggests potential for genuine partnership rather than codependent dysfunction. The paradox reveals that the very behaviors designed to win avoidant love, patience, understanding, accommodation of their patterns, actually prevent such love from developing by signaling low value and eliminating the scarcity that makes someone worth pursuing. Your indifference succeeds where patience fails because it creates psychological conditions where their attachment can develop without triggering defensive responses to perceived suffocation. Most importantly, Understanding this paradox reveals that avoidant attachment requires feeling safe from engulfment while simultaneously fearing loss of access to someone valuable. Your emotional independence provides both conditions by eliminating intimacy pressure while creating genuine possibility that you might permanently exit their life if they don't invest effort to maintain your interest and demonstrate appreciation for access to your time and emotional energy. Maintaining this boundary without losing yourself. The greatest challenge in establishing the boundary of complete emotional independence with an avoidant involves maintaining authentic self-sufficiency without transforming into equally emotionally unavailable person, without sacrificing your capacity for genuine vulnerability when appropriate, and without losing the very qualities that make you capable of authentic love and healthy, intimate connection. This boundary requires walking a razor's edge between genuine independence and defensive detachment, between healthy self-protection and harmful emotional numbness. Maintaining this boundary authentically means developing genuine sources of satisfaction, meaning and emotional fulfillment that operate independently of romantic relationships, rather than performing independence while secretly organizing your emotional life around whether the avoidant responds to your indifference with pursuit. Your independence must stem from actual investment in career, friendships, hobbies, and personal growth that provide real satisfaction rather than serving as strategy to manipulate avoidant behavior. Understanding this maintenance means recognizing that if you're constantly monitoring whether your independence is triggering their pursuit, analyzing whether your indifference is working, or performing self-sufficiency while desperately hoping they'll notice and respond, you've lost the boundary because your emotional state still depends on their response rather than operating truly independently of their behavior and relationship choices. The boundary requires actually building a life so fulfilling that the avoidant's presence enhances rather than defines your experience, where their attention provides enjoyment rather than validation you desperately need, and where their love represents wonderful addition rather than essential component of your psychological stability and sense of worth. This cannot be faked through strategic behavior while internally remaining emotionally dependent. Maintaining authenticity also means preserving your capacity for appropriate vulnerability within healthy relationships rather than developing defensive patterns that mirror the avoidance dysfunction. Your independence should protect you from exploitation while maintaining your ability to be genuinely open, emotionally available, and authentically vulnerable with partners who demonstrate capacity for reciprocal care and sustained emotional investment. The boundary becomes self-destructive when maintaining it requires you to suppress your authentic feelings, deny your genuine attachment needs, or develop emotional numbness that prevents healthy connection, not just with the avoidant, but with all potential partners. Independence that damages your capacity for genuine intimacy represents harmful defensive adaptation rather than healthy boundary that protects your well-being. Most importantly, maintaining this boundary means recognizing when it's not creating healthy relationship dynamics, but rather enabling continued dysfunction where you've simply matched the avoidant's emotional unavailability, rather than establishing genuine independence that allows authentic connection to develop. Two emotionally distant people maintaining careful boundaries doesn't constitute healthy relationship regardless of whether such dynamics prevent the avoidant's defensive withdrawal. The boundary maintenance requires honest self-assessment about whether your independence serves your authentic well-being or simply represents strategy to manipulate avoidant attachment, whether your indifference reflects genuine contentment or performed disinterest designed to trigger their pursuit, and whether your self-sufficiency emerges from real emotional health or defensive protection against someone whose patterns have wounded you. Understanding healthy maintenance means acknowledging that this boundary should feel natural rather than effortful, should enhance your life satisfaction rather than requiring constant vigilance, and should emerge from genuine emotional development rather than strategic behavior modification designed specifically to trigger avoidant pursuit while sacrificing your authentic emotional needs. The boundary becomes most effective when you genuinely no longer care whether it triggers their attachment because you've developed such authentic independence that their pursuit becomes irrelevant to your well-being rather than representing the validation you've been strategically working to obtain through performed indifference and manufactured self-sufficiency. Most significantly, maintaining this boundary authentically means recognizing when the avoidance response to your independence reveals they lack capacity for healthy relationship regardless of boundary effectiveness. If your genuine independence triggers only their comfort with minimal effort rather than genuine pursuit and sustained investment, you've discovered they cannot provide authentic partnership, and your boundary should lead to exit rather than continued hope for their transformation. The boundary maintenance ultimately serves your protection and growth rather than strategy for winning avoidant love, making your willingness to walk away when they fail to respond appropriately the final test of whether your independence is authentic or simply elaborate performance designed to manipulate their behavior while sacrificing your own emotional needs and relationship standards.